أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. In the last episode, this is the third episode of Introduction to Rijal Studies. In the last episode, we talked about the Akhbari school of thought and their view of Ilm al-Rijal and how they viewed this, how they viewed Rijal studies as an existential threat to the Shi'i school of thought. Because they believed that everything in the four schools, in the four books of hadith is authentic. Everything there is credible. Everything there was stated by the Ahlul Bayt. So there's no need to check, fact check, basically, as we would say, and to see if the chain of narrators is authentic or not authentic, because everything in the four books is authentic. And Al-Hurr al-Amili, and we mentioned this in the last episode, Al-Hurr al-Amili, in the last volume of his book Wasa'il al-Shi'a, he mentions 5 proofs and evidence that all the ahadith and narrations in the 4 books of hadith, Al-Kafi by Al-Shaykh Al-Kulayni, من لا يحضره الفقيه by Shaykh Al-Saduq, Al-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar by Shaykh Al-Tusi, these 2 books. Everything in them is authentic. Everything in them was stated by the Ahlul Bayt. We mentioned one proof and evidence in the previous episode, which was basically that the authors of Al-Usul Al-Arba'mi'ah, the authors of the 4 booklets of hadith, which were basically the companions of the Imams, they were the authors, and those booklets, they were passed from generation to generation until it reached the 3 authors, the 3 Muhammads, Al-Kulayni, Al-Saduq and Al-Tusi. They took their job very seriously, and they showed what they wrote to the Imams, and the Imams confirmed that these are authentic narrations. And we said that just because they take their job seriously, it doesn't mean that everything in their booklets is authentic. And 2, who said that they showed everything that they wrote to the Imams? Yes, some of them did. For example, Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, he had a book called Yawm wa Layla, meaning the acts, the devotional acts and acts of worship for days and nights. He showed it to one of the Imams, I believe Imam Rida. Imam Rida told him, هذا ديني ودين آبائي. This is my religion and the religion of my forefathers, meaning that I confirm everything in this book. Good. This was for Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, but this doesn't mean that everyone else did the same. And 3, we need a chain of narrators to the different copies of these booklets. How did Al-Kulayni rely on these booklets? He didn't rely on the original. There were copies that he relied on. And that copy, maybe the original is perfect, but the copy isn't perfect. So we need a chain of narrators so that we may rely on that copy. So this proof, it doesn't prove that everything in the 4 books is authentic. Now, the second proof that Al-Hurr al-Amili mentions in the 30th volume of his book Al-Wasa'il al-Shi'a is that the 3 Muhammads, Al-Muhammadun al-Thalath, Al-Kulayni, Al-Saduq, Al-Tusi, they relied on reliable books. These guys were professionals. They knew what they were doing. And they collected their books from authentic booklets of hadith. They were masters of the profession. And they themselves, in their introductions, for example, Al-Kulayni, in the introduction to Al-Kafi, he says that I was asked to collect the authentic narrations of Ahlul Bayt, and I did. As-Saduq, in his book, من لا يحضره الفقيه, he says that I was asked to collect ahadith that are sufficient for someone who wants knowledge of fiqh. And I did, and I collected the ahadith that I see them as authentic, and I give my fatwa based upon these narrations. وَأَرَى أَنَّهَا حُجَّةٌ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ رَبِّي. I see that these narrations, they have an authority over me. I will use them on the Day of Judgment to tell Allah, see, I'm safe because of these narrations. Or Allah will use them against me to say that why didn't you act upon these narrations? They're hujjah. They have an authority. They're binding. So, if the authors, they testify to the authenticity of their narrations, why do we need to refer to ilm al-rijal and check every individual narration and see is it reliable or is it not reliable? This is the second proof and evidence that Al-Hurr al-Amali mentions. The answer. Al-Kafi, Al-Kulayni in his book Al-Kafi, As-Saduq in his book Milah al-Faqih, they relied on a specific methodology that we don't exactly know what it was to authenticate certain narrations. So according to Al-Kulayni, the narrations in his book are authentic based on his methodology. Now, what is his methodology exactly? We don't know. He's just telling us that these narrations are authentic. But when we study those narrations, we see that some of them don't have a strong chain of narrators. Some of them conflict with the Quran. Some of them conflict with one another. His book and Al-Kafi, there are some conflicting narrations. Now, how am I supposed to accept these narrations? What was his methodology? Plus, he's a jurist, he's a scholar with his own methodology. As a scholar, it is my right to question his methodology and to tell him that this hadith is authentic based upon your methodology, but based upon my methodology, it's not. How can I, as a jurist or any other jurist, rely on the methodology of another jurist? According to his ijtihad and understanding, Al-Kulayni, these narrations are authentic. But according to me, how can I follow him? This will become taqleed. And theoretically, we are trying to perform ijtihad. Why do we need ilm al-rijal? Why are we referring to the narrations? Because I'm trying to perform ijtihad. I'm trying to derive laws according to my understanding. So the narration has to be authentic according to my understanding, and not the understanding of Al-Kulayni. So what if Al-Kulayni deems it as authentic? I'm not performing his taqleed. He's a mujtahid, he performed his ijtihad, and I'm performing my own ijtihad. He has his understanding, and I have my understanding. So even if Al-Kulayni or As-Saduq, they say that everything in our books are authentic, it's authentic based according to their understanding, based on their understanding and on their methodology, and not necessarily on mine. And maybe if I saw their methodology, I wouldn't accept it. Just like today, the different maraja and jurists. Do they accept each other's methodology? Not necessarily. Some of their methodology is the same, and there are others, they're different. That's why you have different fatwas on different issues, because their methodology is different. If all of them, their methodology was the same, they'd all have the same fatwas. So how can I rely on the methodology of someone else? I have to refer to ilm al-rijal to test this narration, to see how authentic is it. Is it authentic or is it not authentic? While we know that the imams, they told us to take narrations from authentic, from credible sources. In one hadith by Imam al-Hadi, he was asked, someone asked him, who should I rely on? Who should I take my knowledge of religion from? He told him, Al-Amri, Thiqati. Al-Amri is a reliable source, refer to him. Meaning that anyone who's reliable, you may refer to him to take your knowledge from him. Take your narrations from someone reliable. This is a fact. that I can rely on a reliable source. And someone who's not reliable, I can't rely on. Now, Al-Kafi, he narrates narrations. Some of them have a credible chain of narrators, and some of them don't. The ones that are credible, I could take. But the ones that don't have a credible chain of narrators, how can I accept them? Just because Al-Kulayni claims they are authentic, but when I look at the chain of narrators, some of them are not authentic. Some of them are not credible. How can I rely on them? So this is 2. 3, Al-Hurr al-Amili says that the Ahl al-Bayt, they were so compassionate towards the Shia that they made sure their companions record their narrations, write their narrations. And that shows that these narrations are authentic, because the Imams were so merciful, they were so compassionate towards their companions and their followers, that they didn't want their followers to receive anything inauthentic. They would make sure that their companions, they write and they take care of their writings. So that must mean that everything that their companions wrote has to be authentic. And my answer to this third proof and evidence from Al-Hurr al-Amili is that yes, the Imams, they were merciful, they were compassionate towards their followers and their companions. And they did their job. They gave their teachings and they asked their students and companions to write everything. But we know for a fact that some people, they came and they fabricated narrations in the name of the Imams and in the names of the Ahl Bayt. In fact, some of them would even take these books and they would put narrations in them and then give them back to their authors. They were cons, they were con artists. They would say, let us read these books. They would come, they would put narrations in those books and give it back to the authors. And the authors, they don't know. They would give their books to others for them to transcribe. And so many of these fabricated narrations would spread. So how do I know if I could rely on these narrations? There has to be a chain of narrators. There has to be an authentic chain of narrators, a credible source that tells me I heard from so-and-so who is credible, and he heard from so-and-so who is also credible, he heard from the Imam. So just because the Imams, they made sure that their companions write their narrations, it doesn't mean that what reached us is all authentic. Because after the Imams, we do know that they were fabrications. The fourth proof and evidence is similar to the third, but it says that the Imams asked their companions to write. And there's a hadith that says, سَيَأْتِي زَمَانٌ لَا يَأْنَسُونَ فِيهِ أَوْ لَا تَأْنَسُونَ فِيهِ إِلَّا بِكُتُبِكُمْ. A time will come where your only solace is with your books. Which books? That has our narrations, the narrations of the Ahl Bayt. So write, make sure you write everything. Everything that we say, write it. And so that means everything that was written by the companions of Ahl Bayt has to be authentic. Again, there's no relation. Just because the Imams told their companions to write everything, it doesn't mean that what reached us was authentic. Yes, the direct companions of the Imams, perhaps they were all credible, but what about those who transcribed those ahadith from generation to generation to generation? These ahadith that reached us, who says that they are exactly the ahadith that were stated by the Imams? It's just like a Chinese whisper. A Chinese whisper starts out with one person. You say what you want to say to one person, but after 30 people, when it reaches you, there's additions, there's subtractions. The original statement was changed, was altered. So how can you rely on a chain of narrators that is inauthentic? But when there's a chain of narrators that says so and so who's credible, relied on so and so who's credible, and they're all credible, خلاص. بعد we don't have any other option. We rely on someone who's credible because the Imams told us rely on people that are credible. So just because the Imams told their companions to write their books, it doesn't mean that those books reached us authentically. We have to see how did they reach us, from which sources, who brought us those books. And finally, in his fifth point and evidence, Al-Hurr Al-Amili says that we know there were a lot of booklets of hadith that were written at the times of Ahlul Bayt, and the Ahlul Bayt, they saw those books, they read those books, and they confirmed those books. For example, the book of Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, books by Al-Fadl ibn Shadhan, books by Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Saffar, books by Ubaidillah ibn Ali al-Halabi, and so on and so on. These books, booklets of hadith, they were shown to the Imams, and the Imams confirmed them. So what more do you want? Why do you want chain of narrators? As we said in the beginning, and the first proof of evidence that Al-Hurr Al-Amili says, that Al-Hurr Al-Amili mentioned, that yes, some of these booklets, they were shown to the Imams, and the Imams confirmed everything in these booklets. But that doesn't mean all 400 booklets were shown to the Imams. Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 of them were shown to the Imams, and the Imams confirmed everything in these booklets. But this doesn't mean all 400 books, 400 booklets of hadith that became the sources for the 4 main compendiums of hadith, Al-Kafi, Man la yahdhur al-faqih, Tahdhiban al-Istibsar. Who said all of them were shown to the Imams? No. Definitely some of them were not shown to the Imams. So this doesn't prove anything as well. And hence, what Al-Hurr Al-Amili mentioned in the last volume of Wasa'il al-Shi'a, these 5 pieces of proof and evidence, we cannot rely on, and we stand firmly and say that we still need ilm al-rijal, because not everything in the four books of hadith is authentic. And here I will end with this chapter. Do we need ilm al-rijal or we do not need ilm al-rijal? We reach the conclusion that we still need ilm al-rijal. Now, I'll begin another chapter, and the chapter is the following. How do we refer to scholars of Rijal? And what proof do we have that we may rely on scholars of Rijal? To explain, we have 2 groups of scholars of Rijal. We have the scholars of the formative period that came at the beginning of Al-Ghaybat al-Kubra. These scholars include Al-Kishi, who has a book on Rijal, Al-Tusi, Al-Najashi, Al-Barqi, Ibn al-Ghadairi. These were scholars of Rijal in the formative period that have books on Rijal. Basically, you'll find they're very small books. They'll list the name of the companions of Ahlul Bayt, and they'll say, is he credible or is he not credible? Thiqa or da'if? Is he reliable or is he not reliable? And some of them, they show which level was he. He was a companion of which imam. So that also helps us understand where, from a timeline perspective, where does this narrator fall in? Is he from the companions of Imam al-Baqir, or Imam al-Sadiq, or Imam al-Kadhim, or Imam al-Rida, or any of the other imams? So what proof and evidence do we have to refer to these? What's the basis? What's the foundation of referring to scholars of Rijal? Why? So this is one level of jurists, one level of scholars of Rijal, ulama al-Rijal, during the formative period. And there's another level called the mutaakhirun. The first are the qudama, the early scholars, the pioneering scholars of Rijal. The second are al-mutaakhirun, later scholars of Rijal. This includes Al-Allam al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood al-Hilli, Ibn Tawus, Sayyid ibn Tawus. These scholars came 200 years after the formative period. So basically the time period between Al-Shaykh al-Tusi and Al-Allam al-Hilli is approximately 200 to 250 years. My question now is that how can we rely on the early scholars of Rijal, ulama al-Rijal, the early ones? On what basis and on what foundation do we rely on them? Here, there's various opinions. One is that these scholars of Rijal, they are authentic narrators. It's as if they're narrating a narration. Just like Zurara when he says, Imam al-Sadiq said this or that, and we rely on him. Shaykh al-Tusi was reliable. Najashi was reliable. Ibn al-Ghadari was reliable. Al-Barqi was reliable. These scholars are reliable. Al-Kishi was reliable. When they tell us that this narrator is credible, we can accept. If they tell us that this narrator is unreliable, we should accept. And this is the opinion of As-Sayyid al-Khoi. As-Sayyid al-Khoi says that the same proof and evidence that we had for accepting a narration, Hujjiyat Khabar al-Wahid, we will use here to refer to scholars of Rijal. Scholars of Rijal are authentic and credible sources. We may refer to them when they tell us if so-and-so narrator is credible, or so-and-so narrator is not credible. And this is the view of Sayyid al-Khoi. But there is one problem. Or it's not really a problem, because Sayyid al-Khoi accepts this. A narration, for a narrator, for a transmitter of hadith, for his hadith to be accepted, his narration has to be based on what he heard and saw, and not based on his judgment, not based on his ijtihad, not based on his understanding, but based on what he saw or heard. This is very important. Transmitter of hadith, we take his hadith based on what he saw and heard, and not based on his ijtihad. Why? This is an ilm al-usul, usul al-fiqh. In usul al-fiqh, we learn that a hadith is accepted as long as the transmitter is telling us what he saw and what he heard, not what he feels or what he understands, not what he understood. So this is not a matter of ijtihad, it's not a matter of opinion. A hadith it's a matter of what you saw, not your opinion. So when it comes to ilm al-Rijal, it has to be the same. A Rijali, a scholar of Rijal, when he tells us this person's reliable and that person is not reliable, he has to tell us based on what he saw and what he heard, not based on his opinion of this Rijali, and not based on his opinion of this narrator and transmitter. For example, if Shaykh al-Tusi tells us this person's weak, that means he either heard or saw that narrator, or it came down to him from a reliable source. but that person's unreliable. We cannot rely on a Shaykh Tusi if it's his opinion, if it's his judgment that this person is reliable. Why? Because, for example, he read his narrations and he discovered that his narrations do not conform to the Quran, and so he deems them as unreliable. No, that becomes an opinion. Based on this first theory, the first basis on why we refer to scholars of Rijal is that he's a reliable narrator and he's telling us that this person's unreliable. That has to rely on what he saw and what he heard, based on his senses, not based on his opinion. So if it's based on his opinion, we can't rely on him. This is important because we will need this later on, inshallah, when we discuss whether we could rely on the later scholars of Rijal, like Al-Alam Al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood Al-Hilli, Ibn Tawus. After we finish discussing the early scholars of Rijal and why we rely on them, we will discuss the later jurists of Rijal and whether we could rely on them. There, Sayyid Al-Khoi will tell us we can't rely on them. Why? Because they are not authenticating the narrators based on what they heard and saw, but based on their opinion, based on their judgment, based on their ijtihad. So this is important, and we will need this later on. So this is the first theory. The first theory of why we refer, this is the first basis, or the first opinion, on why we refer to scholars of Rijal, the early scholars of Rijal, because they are authentic narrators telling us that this person is reliable and that person is not reliable. And again, this is the opinion of Sayyid Al-Khoi. Two, the second theory or the second opinion of why we refer to scholars of Rijal is that this is a testimony, a shahada or bayyina. At-Tusi is testifying to the credibility of that scholar, of this narrator or that narrator. Najashi is testifying. This is a testimony. It's not a narration. While the first theory was telling us this is merely a narration, khabar al-wahid. Tusi is merely narrating to us the authenticity of this narrator or that narrator. But the second theory is telling us this is a testimony. It's just like standing in court and giving a testimony, being a witness, witnessing that this person is reliable or that person is not reliable. Shahada, bayyina. And this too is the opinion of Sayyid Al-Khoi. Sayyid Al-Khoi has two opinions. He says that the view of a Rijali scholar, why do we refer to a Rijali scholar? He's either narrating to us or he's testifying to the credibility or lack thereof of certain narrators. But there's one problem, again, with this theory, and that is in a testimony, in a shahada, when you stand in court, in an Islamic legal court, the witness has to have certain qualities. Number one, he has to be a man, a male witness. Or one male witness is equivalent to female witnesses. So, number one, masculinity. Two, he has to be alive. You cannot rely on a dead witness. A testimony has to be someone who's alive. Three, he has to be adil. He has to be religious. You cannot rely on the testimony of someone who's not religious. Now, that's not a problem when it comes to Tusi and Najashi, who are the main scholars of Rijal. They're both male and they're both religious, but they're not alive. So how can we rely on what they say based upon a testimony? But some said, no, this is not really a problem, because what we mean by a testimony is not an actual literal testimony in court. It's a testimony when you sit and say, this person's a really good person. I think you should work with this person. I think you should hire this person. Or if someone comes and asks for the hand of your daughter, you tell them, I think you should give your daughter to this person. That's a testimony. It's not an actual testimony in court, but it's a form of testimony. So you don't have to be a male, you could be a female. You don't even have to be religious. As long as that person does not lie, he doesn't have to be religious. He doesn't necessarily have to pray, but he doesn't lie. You could still rely on him. This is the second theory on why we refer to a Rijali scholar. This is the second theory on the basis for referring to a Rijali scholar. As for the third, we will mention in the fourth episode, the coming episode, inshaAllah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.